the Election Reformers Network. Heather is a fifth generation New Mexican and brings over 25 years of experience in public policy, research, citizen deliberation, legislative advocacy, voter education, and coalition building to the Election Reformers Network. I know several of our members have seen her speak before and highly recommended her as a speaker for our general meeting. She is a senior consultant to the nonpartisan Issue 1 and the Carter Center, where she advises on advancing reforms to strengthen American democracy, which is certainly one of the issues and the concerns that we've been talking about with the League. Heather is also the previous president and executive director of New Mexico First, a cross-partisan public policy organization co-founded by U.S. Senators Jeff Bingaman and Pete Domenici. Heather's previous employers include the Thornburg Foundation, where she managed a $1.2 million portfolio of good government investments, as well as the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Commission on Presidential Debates, and the California Center for Civic Participation. Heather holds a master's degree in political communication from the University of Maryland and a bachelor's degree in journalism, and she's married and is a mother to 2 young adults. We're so excited to have Heather speak to us today. And Heather, take it away. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Laura. And I appreciate that generous introduction. I think that makes me sound considerably smarter than I actually am, especially today. So you have my apologies in advance. I'm going to share my screen here. And if I can get you to just give me a quick thumbs up if you guys can see that. Very good. All righty. Then what I'm going to do is just take us through a handful of things that I have pieces of information that I prepared for some other presentations recently. And for those of you that were part of the statewide meeting of the League, my apologies in advance, because some of these are things that you will have seen before. But what I am hoping that we could talk about today would be a little bit around public trust in elections and the way in which that's changing in our country. Some opportunities for reform of that, including different ways to advance nonpartisan election administration. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of federal reforms that I think are particularly relevant to the dilemma of public trust in elections, and then conclude with the things that I think we probably on this call are most interested in, which are the opportunities for legislative reform here in New Mexico. And with having said that, I will say that I would also share with you that I'm speaking today on behalf, excuse me, on behalf of the Election Reformers Network, which is a national organization that aims to modernize the U.S. democratic process. We want to see the democratic process as trusted as we can be. And while many of you on this call, we have all worked together on New Mexico policies before. I will say that I'm the first person on their staff that's a state level policy person. Their staff is principally people who have worked nationally and internationally, and their board is all international. And so what's interesting about that is they look at it through the lens of what can the United States learn from other countries when we think about our own democratic process. And that's an interesting way to flip the conversation, because most of the time we say with great pride that America invented the modern democracy, and we did. But just because we went first doesn't mean that we got everything right. And so there are some things that we can learn from other countries that seem to be working better. And so that's the lens under which the Election Reformers Network was developed, was to learn from international examples. So when we think about what's happening here in America, I just want to quickly point out the degree to which confidence in the electoral system is declining. So January 2021, CNN ran a poll that indicated that roughly 40% of Americans had little or no confidence in the electoral process, or that the electoral process would accurately reflect the will of the people. By September, that number had grown to 52%. By February, that number had grown to 56%. And just before this call, I looked up the new number, which was released last month, which is now 58%. So this number is the bad number, and it's the one that's growing. And so we have to think, what would it take for us in America, and then for us on this call, for us here in New Mexico, to see the kind of changes that would bring back confidence in the electoral outcomes. And the notion that the administration of our elections is a critical item is not one that is just identified by Election Reformers Network or just by secretaries of state. I pulled this particular screenshot from the cover of The Economist last spring, in which they identified partisan election administration as what they saw as a greater threat to the American electoral system, even than voter suppression. Now, when we think about electoral and election administration, we typically are thinking of our secretaries of state. Now, we also, in our state, we also rely on the independence and trustworthiness of our county clerks. But on this particular slide, what I'm showing you are the secretaries of state, 19 races where we have people running for that office who have in different ways denied the results of the 2020 election or expressed a willingness to overturn future elections. And so when we say, you know what, we want people who are running the elections to be independent of their party, we don't want them putting their thumb on the scale. The frustrating and worrisome thing we're seeing in our country right now is the number of people who are running for office for Secretary of State with a promise to put their thumb on the scale. It's a whole different kind of problem. And I'm going to say that the US is just flat out not normal in this regard. And when I've gotten to the slide in some other places where we're not on Zoom and people are in person, what you hear is audible chuckles to this particular screen, because we're not normal when it comes to how we think about election administration and the ways in which we are choosing to allow people to run on a platform of putting their thumb on the scale to advantage one side or another. And so just as one example, this is a comparison between the methods for election administration in the US compared with Canada. And one of them is their policies regarding whether chief election officials, what we call secretaries of state, can run for a higher office while they're in office as the Secretary of State. In the US, we have 0 of 40 states that have that particular scenario. The reason it's not 50 is because there are some states that simply don't have a Secretary of State. They have a different structure altogether. But compare that over here with Canada, and of their provinces and territories, all of them, 100% have a prohibition on running for higher office while you're serving as the chief election official. Similarly, in Canada, all of their provinces and territories have an ethics code that requires impartiality by their secretary, their equivalent of a Secretary of State, whereas in our state, only 10 of the 40 relevant ones would have that, something along those lines. Oops. Voting is another one that I think is so interesting. In most of the provinces and territories in Canada, election officials don't even get to vote in the elections that they're overseeing. And even in the provinces where that is not legally prohibited, it is commonly accepted and they opt out. Versus in our country where, by golly, you for sure get to vote. And there's pros and cons, I think, of that. But I think it just points to the very different attitudes we see in other places. The last one I'm going to point up is that here in our country, we elect, we don't go for an appointment model for the secretaries of state, and in Canada they do. And so by going with an appointment model, they depoliticize some of the selection process. And so when we think about what do we do instead, there's different ways we could think about it. There's an appointment process one could consider that says that would be sort of like the way we in New Mexico use the Judicial Nominating Commission to select secretaries of state or county clerks. There's approaches that are more like the way some school boards are handled, where the elections are nonpartisan. And then there is this option right here, which is being introduced as legislation in New Mexico by Election Reformers Network in this cycle, which is an ethics code that requires statutory oath of neutrality, statutory prohibition on endorsement of other candidates in the races that you're running, that you're overseeing, prohibitions on fundraising for candidates in races you're overseeing, and stepping back from recusing yourself from decisions if there's a contest regarding your own race. So let's imagine that I, Heather Balas, was running for secretary. I was Secretary of State and I was running for Congress. If there needed to be a recount over my run for Congress, under this, I would step back from being the election official that was overseeing that recount. And so it's pretty simple, straightforward concept. All three of those models, including the one that we're trying to run here in New Mexico, are laid out in pretty significant detail in these materials that are available on the Election Reformers Network website. And if you go to their main page, electionreformers.org, you'll find these big bold links. They're super easy to locate, and I can send them around to people if not. And then that's the big piece. I'm going to pause right there and say that's the first part of my presentation, which is about election administration reform. The other things I'm going to talk about, which are federal and which are specific other legislative reforms, are different. And I'm wondering if I should pause for a second and see if people have questions of this one, or would you prefer me to just keep going and then we'll take questions for the whole thing at the end?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think that if anyone has a question they'd like to ask right now, this is a good time to do it. And also, any member could put a question in the chat if it comes up during Heather's talk, and she can answer it when she has an opportunity to take a pause. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask right now before she moves forward?
I would like to ask a question, Heather. I think you said there were 10 states that that barred secretaries of state from voting. Did I misunderstand that?
So in our country, there are none. In our country, the secretaries of state are not barred from voting in any locations. In Canada, 54% of their provinces legally require it, and in the others, it's voluntary, and it is the common practice for their chief election officials to not vote.
Okay, I think it was the ethics code piece that I was wondering about. Is New Mexico one of those 10 or not? It is not, is it?
We are not, but we could be at the end of this year if our bill passes.
Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Hello. Another question, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
In the nomination process for the Secretary of State, where in those places that have that nomination process, who does the nominating? Do you have an idea?
That's actually a really fascinating question. So in New Hampshire, it is the legislature itself that does the nominating. But then what's interesting is that the vote is a anonymous vote. And so what it means is that the members of the legislature aren't penalized by members of their own party for voting against someone that is in their own same party. And so they end up with almost unanimous selection and retention of their secretaries of state crossing party lines, because they end up with somebody who gets appointed who's very solid and then behaves in a way that is independent and trustworthy and gets renewed. So it's interesting to me how that has worked out for them.
Wow.
Priscilla has a question. Priscilla, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Have to do that, don't I? I'm just distraught with the percentage of distrust in elections. I know it's high, but in that study that was done with those percentages, does it cut across party lines? Is it, say, hitting independent voters? Was anything done to correlate that with party lines? And I don't need to, because I
Yes,
know.
ma'am. There are crosstabs available that let you pull it out by political party. And what I might do is when we get to the end of this, after I stop sharing my screen, I might just poke into the internet for a second and find the link to it, and I'll just paste it into the chat so that you can see it. What they made available, if I'm recalling correctly, and I'm going to apologize in advance in case I'm wrong, but my recollection is that they offered crosstabs by gender, by political party, and one other demographic that was consequential. And I will definitely pop that in the chat for you right after we're done.
Thank you. And also,
Yeah.
Heather, Kathy put a question in the chat relating to those numbers of individuals lacking confidence in our election system. Is any distinction between the portion of those who deny that we had a safe and secure election in 2020, and then those who are worried about what the election deniers are doing, perhaps to undermine that confidence?
Ooh, so I love that question. And so let me tell you that Election Reformers Network is just about to release our own data on this, that asks a very similar question on this. We don't have the multiple points in time like the CNN poll does, but we did in fact build ours so that we can have a crosstab that is just exactly to what you're talking about. So of the people who are I forget how we framed it exactly, but essentially of those who accept an election denier argument, what percentage of them, how do they answer a question like this? So whereas what CNN can give us are the crosstabs for how people answer this question by Democrat, Republican, gender, and something else, we're going to have additional data that I think is going to release within the next 10 days. And I'm happy to send it to Laura and Eileen or whoever you tell me to when that comes out, that offers that an additional slice for how do people answer this question if they are already predisposed to an election denier argument.
That would be great, Heather. We would love
Got
to
it.
see that data. I don't see any other questions, so perhaps we can continue, and then we'll, if anybody has questions, or we can ask more at the end or in the chat.
Sounds great. So the other thing that I think is really relevant for those of us that are following election policy right now is what's happening at the federal level. And I know that we all likely watched some or all of the January 6th hearings and the lessons learned that they might have offered for us in terms of thinking about what comes next. And when we think about, most critically, the Electoral Count Act, I like to present this with the full name of the current law, which is the Electoral Count Act of 1887. So there's a reason that we do really have to get this thing updated. And the intention with the hoped for revised bill is that we would clarify the role of the vice president, that we would narrow the concept of failed elections that can lead to legislatures having the authority to decide an outcome, and that we would have some greater clarity that reins in objections for when it goes to Congress, so that the people who object to the certification of an election when it goes to Congress aren't doing it just because they dislike the outcome, for example. And it is expected that this new bill, which we do expect will have bipartisan sponsorship, it may be taken up and potentially voted on. We are hoping voted on during the lame duck session. We do not believe that it will get voted on before the midterm elections that are coming up, but we might have a window in the lame duck after the elections and before the swearing in of the new people in January to get this law passed. And so we're crossing our fingers. We'll see what happens with that. It's, I think, one of the most interesting things to be following on the federal side. The other thing on the federal side is the appropriation levels that would support state and local elections. And so when we say that we want our elections to be really trusted, we also know that that means that we need our election officials, our county clerks and our secretaries of state. But in this case, a lot of this is about county clerks to have the resources they need to be able to deliver to be able to test their machines well in advance, to be able to hold meetings that are about helping the community members understand the electoral process and the degree to which they can have confidence in the outcomes. There's all kinds of things that state and local election administrators need support to do. And so there are multiple baselines for what the additional funding might look like. And the most expensive piece of that would be the elimination or the mitigation of cyber attacks on election results. And so there's a whole coalition of lawmakers led by Amy Klobuchar that issued a letter to an open letter calling for $5 billion in increased appropriations for state and state and local election officials, election administration. And our own Senator Martin Heinrich signed on to that. President Biden actually issued in his budget a recommendation for $10 billion. And then there's a related proposal that's calling for $250 million. So we'll see, those are really big numbers and they're kind of all over the map right now. We'll see where this lands. But the bottom line is we know we do need additional resources to be able to do the job, to do a good job in the next election. Now, switching back here to New Mexico, there's a handful of there's a handful of legislative pieces that are coming up that might be useful to us to be following. We know that the constitutional amendment to create an independent redistricting commission will be introduced again. Fair District New Mexico is the lead organization on that. That's a League of Women Voters project, and Election Reformers Network is a member of that coalition that's led in the Albuquerque area. That's Dick Mason and Kathy Burke's project. They're the leads on that, and then I think they coordinate with a number of you. I think that you all should have a lot of pride in the League's leadership on this particular issue, this redistricting reform. We also expect that there will be a constitutional amendment legislation introduced again that would allow ranked choice voting in statewide elections. It wouldn't require it, it just would remove the prohibition in the Constitution that currently makes it not palatable for statewide races. We also expect that the State Ethics Commission will again be introducing its ethics and disclosure package. And I haven't seen a copy of that yet, but I think it's one to watch for. And if you're not already on the distribution list for the New Mexico State Ethics Commission, just add your name to their website, and then you'll get it when they release their proposed legislation. There is a large coalition that's working on legislative modernization that could include the compensation of the legislators and potentially the creation of staffers for the legislators. And then the last one here is the one that I've already talked about at the beginning, which is the ethics code for election administrations, and that election administration, the code of ethics piece. And that's the one that my organization is working on. So there we have that. And then the last thing I would say is there's a third project that's going on across the country. It's initiated originally by the Carter Center, but is now being championed by Democrat and Republican groups across the nation, which is called the Candidate Principles for Trusted Elections. And we're trying to see as many candidates as possible sign on to these statement of principles, essentially saying that they'll play by the rules and behave respectfully when they run for office. And the part of that that's perhaps most interesting is that, as I mentioned, the Carter Center initiated the project, but then they gathered input from a whole bunch of folks, including people across from Republican Party interests, boiled their concerns from what was originally sort of a two-page essay around what they thought would be appropriate to these 5 basic principles of an honest process, of civility. I can send around the list. I don't have to read them to you, but they're essentially the baseline of what we would expect of candidates running for office, most critically making any claims of election irregularities in accordance with the law, and then accepting those findings once all of those contestations have been decided. And there's organizations all over the country that have signed on to this project, and we're tickled about that. We're also, and in each of those places, they're asking people to sign up organizations and recruit candidates, to encourage those candidates to create little videos saying that they may not disagree with each other, but they agree that the election needs to be respected, and then engage voters, encouraging their candidates to sign on. It's happening in these 5 states, and New Mexico is the newest one to sign on. The nonpartisan organization New Mexico First is leading this effort in our state and is joined by the New Mexico Chamber and the New Mexico Local News Fund, New Mexico PBS, and a handful of others. I don't believe the League of Women Voters is officially part of this coalition yet, but I believe they could be if they wanted to be, and we'd be thrilled by that. And that, my friends, is, I think, the last of the things that I have to share with you today. What further questions might I answer?
Thank you, Heather. That was a lot of good information. We appreciate all of that. Does anyone have, I know we have a few questions in the chat. Does anyone have any particular question? Joe, you have your hand raised. You're muted, Joe.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. And I'm sorry for my limited knowledge on this. Do states not have a minimum baseline of which type of machines that basically meet a certain standard that they can then purchase for their elections? I mean, is everybody just willy-nilly able to get whatever kind of machines they want? Isn't there a minimum standard? If you're going to have a ballot, then you have to have a certain kind of ballot, or if you're going to have a machine, you have to have a certain kind of machine. Does the federal government not regulate any of that?
My understanding is that that is not regulated by the federal government, although that there are machines that are certified for a threshold of confidence and regularity in terms of the outcome. But and my understanding that here in New Mexico, we have tremendous confidence in the technology that we currently have. Part of the reason that people have said that we need to continue to be ever vigilant in terms of researching what is happening with the technology is that the capacity for people to make mischief is also ever changing. And so that's one of the reasons that we need caution on this item. But my understanding that is that, yes, you are correct. There's a minimum threshold of accuracy and validity in the machines here. And in my understanding is every state in the country, but it's not like there's not like some magic formula from the feds that they all can say they're in compliance with.
Interesting. Thank you.
I also see there's a question about who's sponsoring the bill on impartiality for the Secretary of State, and that is the Election Reformers Network, the organization that I work for. And we don't yet know what lawmaker is our sponsor yet, but give us a couple of days and we think we will.
Okay, Heather, that was my question, because I saw you all were sponsoring it. I wondered what lawmakers were taking that up with you so that League members could contact their lawmakers if they were interested in doing that. Let us know how we can support that effort.
Will do.
There was another question in the chat. In the election reform efforts, how important is training for election officials?
Ooh, I love this question. So there is on the Election Reformers Network website, there is also brand new model legislation that I didn't include in this presentation, but is a model that we're hoping to see introduced in a couple of other states, maybe Michigan. I'm sorry, not Michigan. Michigan's canvassing, but backing up for a second, there's additional model legislation that's available on the Election Reformers Network that is specifically on credentials, qualifications for serving as an election official. And what that bill, were it to be introduced here or elsewhere, does is it says that to be a Secretary of State or a county clerk, you have to have met some thresholds. And those thresholds can be for Secretary of State that you've either already served as a county clerk type office or that you've attended training for that office. And that is much more consistent with the way that election officials are selected and do their job in other countries. They have to have demonstrated they understand how elections work before they get that job. And in our country, we don't make them do that. We let them learn on the job. And so in our, it's an unexpected shift in our country, the degree to which we don't require it. But we would like to see that happen. And so there's the model legislation that I mentioned that we are trying to introduce here in New Mexico on the Code of Conduct. There's the newer model legislation that looks at qualifications for election officials. And we expect that because it's so new, we expect that it will be rolled out in other states, could be here, maybe elsewhere next year. And then there is the related idea of you just change the way that people are selected, period, which could be either through an appointment model or nonpartisan elections. So different ways to think about changing the system to make it more trusted and more truly nonpartisan.
I had a follow-up question to that question, if
Yes,
there's
ma'am.
time here, if I may.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, Ann.
Hi. What do you do if you're thinking about participating in an election? And I've been chatting a little bit with Eileen about this, and you discover that the official you're working with doesn't know what you know from just downloading a manual off the Secretary of State's website.
Oh.
How do you work with that? How do you broach that?
Oh, and so I'm going to say that I wish that the example you just shared is rare. Unfortunately, I think it is not rare. I think a lot of people move into those positions and then learn the job on the way. Now, in other cases, we have very devoted and hardworking county clerks who do come into that space and do their best to be as prepared as they can be. There are others that just are going to be doing their best, but they just may not have the data just yet, or they may be reasonably new to it. So I don't have a good answer for what's the best way to respond to that. Each individual person might that's more a personality question than a policy question. But I would say that it's really very appropriate to surface the manuals, to share it back and say, it appears to me that we're out of compliance or that we are not exactly following the tenets of the manuals on pages blah through blah. Can you explain that to me? And is there anything that my organization can do to support you in getting us in compliance? I would position it in that sort of a we're all in it together to be helpful kind of approach.
Excellent. Thank you.
Anyone have any other? Oh, Johnny, go ahead.
A number of our legislators are also members of this organization, and I'm really sorry that they are not hearing this. Thank you very much. How widespread among the current legislators is knowledge of your organization, Heather?
Not very. Your organization is much better known than is mine here in New Mexico. And so I think that you all are in a position to be really terrific partners if you're able. So the Election Reformers Network is a national group. I mean, I live here in New Mexico and have for most of my life, but my research partners on that project are all over the country. And so our lawmakers, they know your organization, and a decent number of them know me personally, but not many of our lawmakers yet know Election Reformers Network. And we would invite any help that y'all can give us in terms of spreading the word on this reform opportunity.
I recommend that Eileen send the recording of this meeting to all of the elected officials that are on our list.
That would be lovely.
Does anyone else have other questions for Heather? I have just a real quick question, Heather, if no one else has a question. I think that after what's happened in Georgia in particular, this piece about the prohibition of running for another office while serving as Secretary of State seems really critically important, and sort of just as just a boundary lines, a framework for that position. Is the Election Reformers Network thinking about tagging that on to your bill that you're looking at for New Mexico related to the statutory requirement for impartiality of the Secretaries of State?
That's a really good question. My understanding is that we actually did have a bill that called for that particular reform 2 years back. And I'm not recalling right this minute who carried it, who was our bill sponsor. It didn't have the other things that we talked about, but it had that item. And so I think that there is wisdom in considering something that includes it. It was not included in the model legislation because it was identified as something that was so controversial that we would have a much harder time passing it. And so our initial model looked at the most urgent and most achievable items. Not to say that the prohibition on running for higher office while administering elections isn't a big one. It'd be a big one for me, but it's a harder one to get people comfortable with.
Understood. Yes. Okay. Any other last questions before we let Heather go rest?
Stay
All right.
well, Heather. Get well.
Thank you so much. Again, I apologize. I feel like I meandered a little bit today, ladies. So my apologies. But in any event, I hope the rest of your meeting goes great. Thank you so much for the inclusion.
Not at all. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, and take care of yourself.
Will do. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Wow, that was very informative. So thank you, Laura, for setting that up. And Kathy and I talked about some things for the business meeting, but we didn't really decide who was going to say what. So Kathy, why don't you go for it? I'll tag in.
Well, upcoming next Saturday is Constitution Day, and so you might want to do something to recognize the or commemorate the U.S. Constitution. I recently discovered a podcast. I'm not a big podcast user, but a podcast on the Constitution that was referenced in the last voter, and it was a very. I've listened to a couple of them. They're very interesting. 10 days after that, on the 27th, we have National Voter Registration Day. And Karina and Stuart Oberman are doing a lot of work with the schools right around that date to get 18-year-olds registered to vote. I guess the other thing I would mention is that more tying in with Heather's comments, we've been trying to keep an eye on the county commission, in particular, the public input to the county commission on the subject of elections. The discussions from the public have been expressions of distrust in the election process. And so Johnny went to, I think, the first county commission meeting in August and provided public input. They heard she was coming, and so the distrustful people weren't there. I went to the second meeting in August, and they partly because of this group, I think they have moved the public participation portion of the program to the end of the meeting rather than the beginning. I was at the meeting until I was there about 3 hours and 15 minutes when the commission went into executive session to confer with the attorney about a different issue. And at that point I had to leave. So Eileen has subjected herself to the recording and seen the distrustful people I had listened to a previous one. But we are trying to make sure there is a board member at each of these meetings, at least up until the election, because the group indicated that they plan to come to every county commission meeting, at least up until the election. While we'll do our best to have a board member there, it would be wonderful if we could have at least 1 or 2 other league members who would also show up and say a few words, positive words about the election administration process. And you can go on and look for the public input